Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson, and this is your monthly update on the Venice project. I'm doing this one unscripted, so if it's a little more rambling than usual, I hope you'll forgive me. I had thought that the book I've just gone through for material would be the last one for the project. It's Venetian Ships and Shipbuilders in the Renaissance by Frederick Lane. I haven't been posting these daily on X, as was Twitter, because they removed the feature that allowed me to do it automatically, and I didn't have the time to post each of them individually. I think the project will be continuing on Threads and Instagram. While I was looking at this book for material about Venetian shipbuilding, about how the Arsenalotti, the people who work in Venice's early ship factory, lived and worked and could be used as player characters, I ran across another book called Housecraft and Statecraft, Domestic Servants in Renaissance Venice, and I will also be cutting that one down before I start drafting because it's full of material that's useful when writing up grogs and companions. Also, I'm hoping it gives me a method of treating the subject of Venetian slavery with some accuracy and sensitivity. But onto the research for Venetian shipbuilding. Much of it confirms what we already wrote up in City and Guild. There are two basic types of ships until the late 15th century, when a hybrid emerged. There are more specialized forms in the Mediterranean. Warships are more useful in the Mediterranean, but they are less common in the Atlantic. The basic division is between the longship and the roundship. Longships have oars. They're low, narrow. They're called galleys. They have one deck, to begin with at least, and they're used for precious cargo. And the other side of the division are roundships, which have sails. They're high and wide. They're called busses or turrets. They may have up to 3 decks, and they're used for bulk cargo. The book begins with a discussion of the Battle of Sassano, which was in 1264. The Venetians let their small roundships with bulk cargoes just drift off, and their galleys clustered around one great roundship. Roundships, even small ones, could hold off galleys. They moved all their portable valuables to the roundship and used it as a fortress. It had high sides and fore and aft castles, which made it very defensible, but it couldn't protect other ships, and it couldn't project force because it had no guns. Galleys can choose or decline combat, and can work as a unit, and can board or ram. This allows you to use them in formations roughly like cavalry. Before the 16th century, so Magenomia period, oarsmen were free and they used weapons for melee. They were recruited in the Piazza San Marco and they were paid off on return to Venice. In the late 13th century, the Great Galley replaces roundships for trade, and small galleys continue to be used for war. Small galleys are fast and have a deck of about 120 feet long, about 15 feet wide, and the deck is 5 to 6 feet above the keel. They're built to a frame for strength, and the strength is in the frame, not in the hull, and this is because they need to handle the weight of all the oarsmen. Between 1290 and 1540, the trireme is standard, and there are 25 to 30 benches per side, 3 oarsmen per bench, 1 oar per oarsman, and a single deck. The deck has 3 parts: a fighting platform at the front, a stern castle, and the rowing space with a gangway up the centre. The deck is extended by an outrigger frame to 22 feet wide and 106 feet long. Benches are slanted toward the poop deck so that all oars could be in parallel. The oars end with a lead weight on the rower's end. The rower climbs a set of small steps and falls backwards to stroke the oar. Much like in previous months, I have dated these as I go through, but rather than reading the dates, I'll just proceed on. Galleys have bowmen as marines. When not in battle, they're stationed between the rows of the oarsmen, so they're not in the way of the sailors. There is some note of an archer on every bench. In battle, they might be on the fighting platform, or the castle, or the gangway. The commander is always on the castle. There are also at least 8 sailors for the rudder and sail. There is usually 1 mast, it's lanterne-rigged, and it's stepped forward. At this stage, there are 3 rudders, a stern post and 2 side rudders. Over time, the stern rudder replaces the side rudders. Stern rudders appear in the Mediterranean in about 1300. They are not good sailors. They are speedier under oar. By the 16th century, captains complain they are so low in the water they're wave-swept, and they cannot tack to windward without dragging oars, which causes them to lose speed and snaps their oars. Cannons make their forecastles so heavy that it dips into the waves when headed into the wind. There are also small galley-like ships with 1 or 2 oarsmen per bench used for dispatches or patrols. These are called fragantes, brigantes, galotes, and fustes, and they're technically a bireme. The great galleys were invented in 1294 or 1298 and were in general use within 10 years. They are more seaworthy than the small galleys, they have more cargo per crew member, and they are slower, so small galleys are still used for portable and valuable cargo. Just after 1299, they start using merchant caravanning, which is where all the ships form together into a fleet. A great galley has a crew of over 100. All goods, save exceptions, in great galleys must be in caravans. The state elects the commanding officer of the fleet. They arrange the crew, the equipment of the galleys, and the sailing time and the destination, then renting out space to merchants. Late in the 14th century, all of the galleys are owned by the state and space on them is rented, although the merchants pay for arming. Private ships are forbidden to follow the same routes as the great caravans. There's no high foredeck or castle, there's one deck. Different routes have slightly different designs. The largest are the ones that travel to Flanders and have a displacement of 140 tons. And that's in the 14th century. In the 15th century, they expand to 200 tons. And in the mid-15th century, there is one dominant design, which is 250 tons below deck. Great galleys are snubber than small galleys. Small galleys are about 8 times as long as they are wide. Great galleys are only about 6 times as long as they are wide. They are difficult to row under cargo because they're low in the water, they have bad oar geometry, and they are mostly rowed to enter or leave port or in some emergencies. Some commanders leave 2/3 of their oars at home because they're penalised when they lose or break oars. There is a note of a fleet sailing from Southampton in what's now the United Kingdom to Otranto in what's now Italy in 31 days. My notes here say that the castle is in 3 stories. The 3 stories. The first story is the steersman and compass, the middle is the lord or captain and his messmates, and the lowest is the ladies and treasure, and it's unlit save by a hatchway above it. There are 2 boats for landing in harbour, and there are steps down the side for embarking into a boat. The kitchen is on deck. It's not covered in. There is a cellar beneath. It has 3 masts. The central mast is the largest. 2 swivel guns. And then I made an attempt at a diagram which just won't translate into a podcast at all. I am not certain that is particularly good. I would love to get a decent deck plan for this, so I will have to rummage around further or pass this on to someone who does deck plans and hope they can make sense of it all. At the start of the 15th century, these ships had 2 masts, and the foremast was the largest. By the mid-15th century, they have 3 masts, and by the late 15th century, the main mast is at the centre, and the fore and aft masts are mostly used for manoeuvring. Oars are used to avoid waiting by the shore for favourable wind, because this is a dangerous time, and it means if you have oars, you never are on a lee shore. The crew is 200 plus, and 20 of these are bowmen, a term which continues to be used even once they start using guns in 1486. There is a public contest to get the job, and they hire the best shots in Venice. If the Senate believes a particular voyage is especially dangerous, they may up the number of sailors by 10 or 20. Space on galleys costs more rent than space on round ships, but it's quicker and the insurance is lower, and some skipped insurance entirely, so that weighed into the consideration. Notes on cargo and the end of the great galleys. The tonnage seems low, but extra was carried on deck, and it was not usually used for bulk goods. Each sailor also had some personal wares. I have a note here saying half of galley freight is customs duty, but I need to double check that. That seems high. About 1500, one fleet brings 2.5 million pounds of spices from Alexandria, and I presume he means pounds money, not pounds weight. Fleets headed east carried 300,000 ducats in cash, as well as their cargo. They suddenly go extinct from 1500 to 1535 due to new roundship models with fewer crew, full rig, and artillery. Galleys continue as warships for a while. In 1569, Drake demonstrates broadsides across open galley ore decks, and people start thinking they're a bad idea. The topsail, mizzen, and foresail are more easily handled, and they are safer than the great galley. The monopoly of galleys in the caravans ceases temporarily in 1514 and then permanently in 1534. Round ships take over as passenger ships for pilgrims. Previously, there were privately owned great galleys, which would anchor each day along the coastline. By 1546, round ships take over because they're cheaper if less pleasant to travel in. From 1500 onward, great galleys are remodelled as gunships. One oar pulled by many men is developed to allow great and light galleys to manoeuvre together. In extremes, there are 8 men to a bench. By the 17th century, the standard is 5 men to an oar. My notes say 70 cannon. Is that a 20? 70 cannon, 8 on the prow, 10 on the poop, and the rest between the oars, and these threw a 3 to 5 pound ball. Ships of the line drive them to extinction. Note that the term bus in this book does not match the Danish fishing vessel of the same name, which often appears in English naval history. In 1286, the biggest vessel offered to the King of France was the Rocaforte, which was 500 tons. It was dish-shaped. Its keel was less than twice the size of its beam. Smaller ships in the same fleet had keels that were 2.5 times the size of their beam. It had 4 aft castles and fighting platforms 39.5 feet above the keel. 2 or 3 masts, lateen rig. The foremast was the larger. The mast was as long as the keel, and the yard was longer than the keel. It had 2 side rudders. In 1303, Basque pirates bring square rigs and stern rudders into the Mediterranean, and castles become part of the ship's hull design. This is the cog, used in the 14th and 15th century, and covered in city and guild. Cogs are cheaper and better in storms than round ships. They also have a smaller crew. In the 13th century, a 240-ton ship needs 50 sailors by law, and that doesn't count soldiers or pilgrims, or people who are under 18. In the 14th and 15th century, 20 sailors over 21, 8 apprentices and 4 bowmen were legally required for an identical ship, with the difference that because they had a square sail, they didn't need to yaw the sail, and so they needed fewer people. At the start of the 15th century, ships for the Syrian voyage are 300 tons, and ships for military voyages are 400 tons, and the biggest ships are 720 tons. Bus and turret caravans are made up of round ships of about 300 tons. In the mid-15th century, the new rigging leads to a new ship called the carrack, which is nearly universal by 1485. Its keel's 2.5 times its beam, and it lasts until the 17th century, when Dutch innovations drive it to extinction. In the 12th and 13th century, there were caravans to Alexandria, Cyprus, and Syria twice a year, but each ship only did 1 circle per year, leaving either in March or September. By the 15th century, a ship can do 2 voyages in a year, returning with bulk cargoes of cotton and alum. By 1400, merchantmen were larger. They could be a little over 400 tons. By 1450, the fleet has 6 that are 600 tons. And by 1500, there is at least 1 that's over 1,000 tons. Military ships. In 1486, a 2,400-ton ship is reported, but sources on it aren't good. In 1500, there are many reports of 1,500-ton vessels, and officially war round ships were between 1,200 and 1,500 tons. Merchantmen of that size were not economical, and instead they were about 600 tons. And they were introduced in the middle of the 15th century for bulk goods, like wine to England from Crete, and the grain fleets, salt and oil. The book notes that you could compare those to East Indiamen, which were up to 600 tons, but were generally 300 to 400 tons. Round ships were used for patrols and to control pirates. Pirates used round ships because round ships are easier to take if you yourself have a round ship. Eventually, these develop into their own ship class, the bars, in the late 15th century, and they are about 1,200 tons. The first galleons arrive in Venice between 1526 and 1530, and they're not a successful class at first because they're quite top-heavy. Caravels become popular in the late 15th century. By 1500, they're used a lot in Dalmatia, the Adriatic, and Greece as coastal traders, and they have a lateen rig. Shipbuilding is controlled by a proti, or foreman, generally from a family of foremen chosen by reputation for skill. Foremen could read, write, and studied mathematics. Foremen of the arsenal were not always the best at ship design because they also needed people and managerial skills. So virtuoso foremen were sometimes skipped, often skipped, for more dependable people. There is a legendary shipbuilder called Baxon in 1407, and the feud between his sons and his son's boss is an extraordinary story, which we will probably include into the book at some point. The foreman of the arsenal from 1498 to 1540 was Leonardo Bressan, and he invented the Barza. His second attempt at a ship in this class had 1,200 tons cargo, had 450 plus men as crew, and had 400 guns, by which we must hope they mean marines. The guilds in Venice were not as powerful as those in other Italian cities because the oligarchy was too strong. Their role was religious, vocational, and insurance, a merger of the sculo and the arte, both of which have been discussed in previous episodes. The sculo are for worship, banquets, and insurance, and the arte are for the insurance of professional quality work owed to the state and for resolving disputes between members. The arte is ruled by the government through appointed justices. By the end of the 13th century, basically, these two methods of organising tradesmen had combined. There are three great shipbuilding guilds: the carpenters, the caulkers, and the sawyers. The head of each guild is called a gastaldo, and he is aided by judges, who settle disputes, and deacons, who look after the guild property. The gastaldo and judges must be at a booth in San Marco every Sunday to judge cases. Gastaldo are not elected. They are effectively appointed by their predecessors. They must not hold more than 2 business meetings a year by law, and only 1 banquet. The arsenalotti were powerful, but not as a trade guild. We'll get to them later. Each guild has a chapel, tomb, altars, relics, and art. They give insurance like sick pay, dowries, burials, and pensions. The sawyers kept this money in a chest that needed 3 keys to open, the gastaldo, a steward, and 1 guy whose purpose was just to hold a key. Caulkers had to be hired by lottery for complicated historical reasons. In 1323, the Venetians did something a little unusual for the Italian city-states and said that if you're a master, you could take as many apprentices as you liked simultaneously. The carpenters of the arsenalotti were required to be officers on ships if asked. Then there's a lengthy section on the squarololi, who are the heads of independent shipyards. I looked into this in some detail because I thought a covenant might be built around an independent shipyard as a source of finance. One of the doges, when he dies, leaves a letter, a testament, in 1423. In 1423, the fleet is 3,000 ships of less than 100 tons, 300 ships that are larger than 100 tons, and 45 galleys. That breaks down like this. The 300 vessels larger than 100 tons are about 35 round ships of 240 tons plus, and about 265 round ships of 100 to 239 tons. The larger class of round ships are used for trade to England, Syria, and Crimea. The 45 galleys contain at least 25 light galleys and 18 great galleys, and the difference is 2, or maybe 3, pilgrim galleys, which are probably 250 tons plus each. Pilgrim galleys are used for transporting pilgrims to various holy sites. The author notes that the margin for error in these figures is very high. Shipbuilding slumps in the 1480s. No ships were being made in 1487, but just after that, 6 additional 600-ton ships were added to be used for pirate control and battle. The 1499 survey of the fleet says that there are 25 private ships of 240 tons or higher, plus 4 state-owned ships. There is a note that in 1560, no Venetian is making trade ships in the 120 to 140 ton class. All of them are bought overseas and reflagged in Venice. By 1558 to 1559, there are almost 40 ships in the 240 ton class. The author estimates that the normal size of the fleet is about 30 to 40 ships in the 240 ton class. The average ship wears out every 10 years, so Venice needs to build, say, 4 or 5 a year to cover wrecks. The problem there is that their minimum is quite close to the operating number, so the state is constantly concerned that they're going to run out of ships. Buying ships elsewhere is illegal from 1533, but people seem to do it quite a lot. there are effectively interest-free loans on large ships from that period on, but by 1606, about half of all large merchant ships are foreign-built. The process of shipbuilding. A group of merchants gets together and seeks finance. Shares in ships have been bought and sold in the city since the 11th century. The partnership is called a compania, or company. They elect a leader to keep accounts. He may have reserved cargo space on the ship to compensate for that labour. They then hire a foreman. They appoint a neutral party for resolving disputes between the partners. They define if the foreman or the manager is providing supplies like wood and iron. Then either way, someone hires a steward of supplies, a master for the caulkers, and an accountant for the wages and the uses of materials. And then they hire a shipyard. In the later period, occasionally, the owner of the shipyard and the foreman are the same guy. This is generally, however, not the case. The arsenale. I'm not going to keep doing that. Let's just call it the arsenal. From 1104 to the 14th century, it's about 8 acres in size. It has 5 large warehouses and docks. For the storage or building of 24 light galleys, it's governed by 3 nobles elected by the Grand Council. They must live near the arsenal. Their houses are called Paradiso, Purgatorio, and Inferno. And no, I don't know why. I should look that up. These lords are technically required to supervise work, inspect buildings every 3 days, inspect the vessels every 3 months, and inspect the weapons and rigging every 6 months. There is a reserve fleet of 4 galleys plus 2 smaller ships. I mentioned before that they sent out a fleet in the 13th century of about 100 ships. That was done by enlisting merchants. In 1303 and 1325, the new arsenal is added, which quadruples the size of the arsenal, and it stays like this until 1470-ish. It builds the galleys which are rented out for trade caravans. In peaceful years, 10 guard galleys are the reserve fleet, and if a war starts, a captain general of the sea is appointed and usually given a fleet of 20 to 30 light galleys. During the Genoan siege of Chogia, Venice built 9 great and 25 light galleys to replace the fleet that they'd previously lost to the Genoans. The fleet sent against Genoa in 1431 it was 24 galleys, and in 1432 it was 32 galleys. From 1325 to 1470 there were 10 reserve galleys and 10 to 12 more in mothballs. That is, they didn't have their caulking or rigging, but could be made ready quite rapidly. By 1417 the law changes so that the reserve fleet is 25 in law, although in practice it is less. Trade fleets. 1333, 8 galleys were sent to the Black Sea, 7 galleys were sent to Cyprus and Lesser Armenia, and 8 or more to Flanders. These were 140-ton galleys. Initially, government galleys were sent out and other private ships could tag along. Mid-century, the number of galleys is halved, but the size of the galleys gets larger. They're 200-tonners. In the 15th century, caravans of 14 great galleys are sent to the Black Sea, Flanders, Cyprus, Alexandria, and Beirut, and they continue to get larger and larger. By the end of the 15th century, 20 ships are sent out per year, and 4 to 5 ships are constructed every year. Many ships last 12 years, but some are lost at sea. The police fleet requires 2 galleys a year, and great galleys take twice the work of light galleys. For the arsenalotti in the 15th century, there was a 250-day work year, or a 22-month, so 270-day work year. A note on labour force: 5 sawyers, 10 carpenters, 13 caulkers, plus apprentices and stevedores were required to complete 5 great galleys every second year. To complete 4 light galleys in under 2 years required 2 sawyers, 5 carpenters, and 5 caulkers. And once, during a war, when they needed 20 light galleys in 6 months, they did that with 32 sawyers, 96 carpenters, 96 caulkers, and great galleys at that time were built in groups of 4 or 5. By habit, they sent their newest galleys to Flanders because it was a more difficult trip, and their oldest galleys were sent to Beirut or the Barbary coast because they were in the Mediterranean, which is less rough. The leaving dates of the caravans were Romania before July the 25th, Beirut before the 24th of August, Alexandria at the end of August, and this brought the arsenal in the following income: Beirut and Alexandria, rents of 12,000 ducats a year; Flanders and Romania, 6,000 ducats a year, plus about 9,600 ducats a year as a supplement from the state. The year 1504 is the high point of merchant shipmaking at the arsenal. In 1504, they have 7 galleys on voyage, 9 ready for use, 20 in mid-construction, and 3 over 14 years old. Almost all trading voyages end by 1535, and the arsenal switches over to the war fleet to counter the Turkish expansion. In 1442, they finish 50 galleys and were ready 25 more, and in 1453, they make another 50. The Venetian fleets in 1461 and 1466 were 20 to 30 galleys. In 1470, they once again faced the Turks with a fleet of 40 galleys. They arrive at Negroponte with their 40 galleys to find out that the Turks have bought 300 to 400 ships. They freak out. They flee to Crete. They chase to Crete. Their fleet is utterly destroyed. The Venetians grab every ship they can, 73 galleys of both sizes, save 24, which are left in Venice because they're unfinished, and the fleet is expanded up to 70 to 100 galleys in 1474. At this point, the Venetians decide that the fleet should be 75 great and 100 light galleys, but the arsenal says, we can't do that. So between 1450 and 1460, the arsenal builds up another 20 or so sheds, each of which can house 2 galleys. The Venetian fleet weren't just kept in the harbour, they were kept essentially in a version of dry dock. Eventually, they had sufficient sheds for 80 stored or building, and in 1473, the arsenal doubles again in size, with an area called the newest arsenal. In 1525, they build 50 light galleys and place them immediately in mothballs on land, ready for activation. As they create new galleys, they cycle out these mothballed ones rather than using the newest ones. In 1537, after war with the Turks, the reserve fleet is up to, in law and theory, if not in practice, 100 light galleys, 4 and then 10 great galleys, 8 fusts, 8 brigantines, 8 longboats, and of these, 25 were armed and equipped to sail, and the rest were on land, uncorked, and with their gear in warehouses. By 1633, this was so expensive they couldn't keep it up, and they knocked the total size of the reserve fleet down to 50. Building's done in 3 stages: framing, planking, and then the third bit, which is the bit that Venetians are really fast at, caulking, launching, deck fixings, rigging, mooring, oars, and arming the crew. In 1570, the whole fleet of galleys was made ready, pulled from reserve, in 50 days. Once the arsenal's in 6 acres, it has between 1,000 and 2,000 workers. It's also in charge of lighthouses, salvage ships, lumber yards for merchant spares, ropes for merchant spares, all of that. No private personal property may be bought into the environs of the arsenal, so it's an anti-theft measure. You can't walk out with anything because there's no chance that you bought your hammer from home or something. The doorkeepers of the arsenal, which is surrounded by 15 towers, may not leave their posts. Sentries in the towers call to each other every hour. Watchmen walk the walls. Doors must not be open at night. Boats must not come in at night. There is a vast amount of waste and graft in the arsenal. There is an extensive list of staff who live at the arsenal in the book, which I won't read through now. Gunpowder is mostly kept separate from the arsenal until 1569, when an explosion convinces people that keeping it absolutely separate would be a great idea. I think that the expansion of the arsenal will be a form of Reggio expansion in this supplement. The Arsenalotti. Arsenal workers are used as guards in the piazza during unrest, as firefighters, as torchbearers for the Doge's funeral. They carry the new Doge on their shoulders around the piazza. They guard the palace when it's vacant, and they guard the Great Council, and they also labour in the mint. Wine is passed about in the arsenal 5 to 6 times a day by a wine steward as part of their pay. Pay stewards were the doorkeepers. Thieves could be whipped while wearing a necklace of nails to show that they were a thief. Pay stewards search the workers as they leave. Ships are made out of oak, larch, fir, and come from near to Venice. Elm and walnut are desired for some parts, but they're not essential. Venice has been an exporter of wood since the 10th century, which, considering it's a group of artificial islands in a swamp, is really something. Venice supplies wood to Corfu and Crete for their buildings and ships. There are laws for the conservation of oak groves, which are first passed in 1470 to 1492. The most important woodland is the Val de Montoya in Istria. In 1557, it has 1 captain, and in 1565, he is given 9 subordinate guardians. In Lavenza, oaks were bent as they grew so that they would grow into curved timbers, which were prized for shipbuilding. There are also important groves at Montello, Carpenda, and Clavi, and these could be ferry sites. Then I have a lengthy series of references that I won't read into the podcast because they don't make good audio. The ducat, or zecchio, is a coin of 3.5 grams of gold. And then we talk about units of account and coins, and this is so bad we're going to use the mythic penny instead, but to explain it, here we go. 1 lira is split into 10 soldi, which is split into 240 denarii, which is the pound, shilling, and pence system that we're all familiar with. But that's units of account. When we talk about coins, each unit has a separate system. The lira de grossi a oro is 20 soldi de grossi a oro, or 270 denarii a grossi a oro, or 7,680 piccoli de grossi a oro, which is to say 1 denarius equals 32 piccolo. Now this gives you the gold ducat coin. 1 lira a grossi is 20 soldi a grossi and 240 denarii a grossi, and this gives you the silver grossi coin, and it's worth 26 denarii. A lira de piccoli divides into 20 soldi de piccoli and 240 denarii de piccoli, and this gives you the silver soldino coin. There are also other coins. Eventually the ducat coin and the ducat unit completely part ways, and the ducat coin is called the ducat de oro, or the ducat of gold. The unit is based on the silver subdivisions. So, as an example, in 1545, a ducat in gold is worth 8 ducats 12 soldi in lira de piccolo. So, to focus back in again, the reason all of that's important to us is that characters who set up a covenant in Venice are almost certainly going to want to be involved in the shipping trades. Most of what I've found works perfectly well with city and guild rules and will be laid over the top for flavour. Next month, the research phase of this whole thing should be complete. I had hoped that the research phase would be complete now, because it gets to the point where the research starts becoming tedious and sapping the will to live of the author. But this last book is just filled with useful things about swole gondoliers and what your different companions will do. And it has such distinct Venetian flavour that I think I do need to cover it. Which means the actual drafting should begin in November. So sorry about the apparently slow progress. As you see, I have been progressing on the research. It's just that I haven't been posting it to Twitter as I had been previously, because the API, it is dead. Your saga may vary.